Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me. It's an honor and a privilege, and hopefully I don't make this mic feedback at any point. That was a really lovely introduction, Martin. Thank you. My bag is cooperation and conflict. I'm really excited about that topic. And the aspect that I'm most excited about is how kinship ties into cooperative behavior. I'm going to argue today that kinship is a fundamental aspect of social evolution. It's something that most organisms should care about in one way or another, and that it's not nearly as well studied as it ought to be. And I'm going to start my talk with something I think you'll all find very exciting, which is a slideshow of my family. So here are my parents, and if you look closely and then look back at me, that shouldn't surprise you. If my father looks a little bit awkward in this picture, it's because my very young nephew is holding the camera and might drop it at any moment. That said, he is working. He has a tendency to look odd in pictures in any case, so I thought that first one was a little bit more preferable to this one. Here are my maternal grandparents. The spry man in the yellow shirt is going to be 90 in just a few weeks. This is my paternal grandmother. We've got one of my aunts and her children, my cousins. We've got another aunt, her husband, my uncle, and some more cousins. And we've got myself and my nieces and nephews. And if you've actually been paying attention long enough, you might start to wonder if there was something funny that I just said, that these are my nieces and nephews. I did not lie to you. They are, in fact, my nieces and nephews. What might help to explain the fact that they don't look anything like me is that they are the children of my two older brothers. My oldest brother, Jamie, who looks absolutely nothing like me, and my next older brother, Ryan, who looks absolutely nothing like me and absolutely nothing like Jamie. Now, they are my brothers. We were raised together. We feel familial sentiments the way that anybody would towards their long-standing kin, but we are not genetic relatives. And this is going to be a theme of today's talk, is how kinship is really about genetic relatedness, and how relatedness is a fundamental aspect of human social organization and social organization of pretty much any critter out there. The human social universe is carved into family units. At its very base, there is no more fundamental social unit than the family. We can find this anthropologically anywhere we look. Any culture has at its base the social organization of a family. But the family, as we understand it, is actually a special case of something that's much broader. That broader concept is what I'm going to call genetic relatedness. And that humans, Homo saps, are in fact a special case as well. That there are plenty of other organisms that have something that look like a family, but then there are plenty of other organisms that don't have families, but nonetheless treat relatives differently from non-relatives. So what I'm going to hope to do is to put things in a broader context. Now, if kinship matters, and I'm going to argue that it does, we should expect it to predict all sorts of things. So with humans, this is a long list, and I'm just going to give you a little taste. Kinship predicts a whole variety of things, from communal labor in gardens in a pastoral society, financial support among migrant workers in South Africa, homicide rates. So this is work that Martin Daly and Margot Wilson did here, demonstrating that genetic relatives were protected from violence compared to non-relatives. Social alliances. There's a very famous, fun little study about an Amish church division that fell along relatedness lines. That the new churches were actually, the individuals were more likely to be related to one another than in the old church. And mate choice, that individuals choose mates that are not closely genetically related to them, even if they don't know consciously that these individuals are or are not relatives, which is interesting. So it's not just a question of not mating with your siblings, but not mating with individuals that might be eighth cousins and you don't know this at all. I'm going to say something a little bit provocative. I think the psychology or the psychological study of human kinship is quite embarrassingly in its infancy. Kinship has been a big problem in the rest of social science. Certainly, anthropologists have devoted an enormous amount of effort and time to understanding kinship dynamics. And psychology has been, in the social domain, much more interested in studying the interactions among complete strangers. And while that's interesting, it's not actually what most of the time we do. I'm going to explain in this talk why kinship matters. I'm going to explain how we come to recognize our kin. And I'm going to explain how kin recognition actually affects our behavior. That's the goal, at least. So to begin, why does kinship matter? Well, kinship provides information about genetic relatedness. That's fundamentally what it does. And genetic relatedness turns out to be a core aspect of the evolution of social behavior. And if we're going to talk about evolution, we always have to go to our main guy, Charles Darwin. And the unfortunate fact that while Darwin's theory of natural selection is very close to the vision we currently have about evolution by natural selection, it's not exactly right, and it's not exactly right because unfortunately Darwin didn't have a concept of genes at his period of time. Mendel's discovery of the particulate nature of genetics overlapped with Darwin's life, but only towards the end, and Darwin wasn't familiar with it. Very few people were, and it took a long time to integrate the concept of genetics with natural selection anyway. After Darwin, the next figure that really is relevant to this story is a guy named Bill Hamilton, W.D. Hamilton, who was able to take Darwin's theory and extend it to incorporate genetic relatedness and show that this actually really completes the picture of social evolution, and I'll explain why. And the way Hamilton did this was that he invented a problem, and it turned out to be a very significant problem. It's known as the problem of altruism. He actually shortly thereafter invented another problem, the problem of spite, which is equally significant, though not nearly as well understood. The problem of altruism is well exemplified by eusocial insects. So here we have some honeybees. And eusocial insects, a whole caste of them are sterile. They don't reproduce. Instead, they channel their reproductive efforts towards helping other individuals reproduce, usually the queen in the colony. And the question is, how can this possibly evolve? Because in Darwinian thinking, the only thing that really matters is the reproductive success of the core individual we're examining. But here we have a bunch of individuals who are not reproducing. So first we should get a concept right, and the concept is fitness. Fitness is reproductive success, but it's relative reproductive success. It's the number of offspring an individual rears to reproductive age relative to the average number of individuals reared to reproductive age in the population. So it's not how many babies you have, it's how many more babies you have than anybody else that actually make it to reproduce themselves. And in Darwinian thinking, what matters for social evolution is the core instance is the individual's fitness is carved into one aspect only. It's direct fitness, how many offspring it manages to get to reproductive age. Hamilton extended this. Hamilton pointed out that what matters is not just in an individual's fitness, its own reproduction, but its indirect reproductive success, the reproduction of other individuals. And I'm going to show you why that matters. So imagine these very strange individuals in the population. You've got a population of weird-looking faces, and you've randomly sampled two, and let's say we don't know anything about their genes, so we're taking sort of a Darwinian look at this rather than a Hamiltonian one. One of them is going to perform an action, so we're going to call him an actor, and the other one's going to receive the consequences of that action. We'll call that individual the recipient. So the actor does something that has an effect on the recipient and also has an effect on itself. Let's imagine before the actor does anything that each individual normally would have 3 offspring on average per generation. But now the actor performs an action such that the recipient has lost an offspring and the actor has gained 2. We're going to call this selfish behavior. You get some very demented-looking characters as a consequence of this. And this selfishness can evolve according to Darwinian view. So Darwin approves of this because the actor has gained from doing this. The actor originally had 3 offspring, now has 5 offspring. So selection favors this. This is not a problem for Darwinian thinking, and Hamilton doesn't have to worry about this. It's not the only thing that fits with Darwinian thinking. If the actor does something that helps itself but also helps the recipient, we can call this mutually beneficial behavior. And here Darwin approves of this as well because the actor is gained. It doesn't really matter what happens to the recipient. The actor has gained fitness. The problem comes with altruism and with spite. So in this case, the actor actually pays a cost to help the recipient. Here the actor has lost an offspring per generation on average, and the recipient has gained 2. Darwin does not approve. And Darwin does not approve because the actor has lost fitness. And in Darwinian calculus, all that matters is the actor's reproduction. Same goes for spite, where the actor loses an offspring in order for the recipient to lose, in this case, 3 offspring. Darwin again doesn't approve because the actor has now lost offspring. Individuals who don't act like the actor keep 3 babies, and this actor only gets 2. Does that make sense? Hamilton's thinking was to act as if we could peer inside individuals and figure out what genes they're carrying. Let's imagine there's only 2 genes in the population that cause behavior, cause the social behavior we're interested in. A green gene and a purple gene. And so we've picked two individuals, an actor and a recipient, from the population. They both happen to have the green gene. Now, again, each individual only has 3 offspring who each inherit this gene. So there's 6 copies of that gene in the population if the actor does nothing. But what if the actor acts altruistically? So the actor loses an offspring, but the recipient gains 2. Now there are 7 copies of that gene in the population. There were 6, there are now 7. So selection favors this in Hamiltonian thinking because there's an extra copy of the gene in the population. So even though it didn't come directly from the actor, it came indirectly via the recipient. Spite works the same way. Oh, sorry, Hamilton approves. Spite works the same way, except that now what we expect is that selection will favor a spiteful action when the recipient does not, or is very unlikely to bear the same genes. So the actor is the green gene. If it's going to go out and hurt somebody, it should go out and hurt an individual who has the purple gene, if that makes sense. Because that's a rival genotype in the population. So here, even though there are only 2 copies of the green gene left in the population, there are 3 fewer copies of the purple gene left in the population now. So relatively speaking, there are more green copies than purple copies than there used to be, right? It's actually moved away from equilibrium, so there are more green copies in the population. Again, Hamilton approves of this. So what Hamilton's really done is he's given us relatedness as something that fundamentally matters. And relatedness is something very specific, but also a very simple concept. It's the probability that the recipient shares the same genes, the genes causing the behavior, in the actor beyond chance. And the beyond chance part is really important. I'm going to explain how that matters down the line. But just remember that. So it's about the likelihood that the actor and recipient share the genes causing the behavior beyond chance. Altruism, then, is favored among positive relatives, among individuals who are more likely than chance to share the same gene. In the example before, they both are more likely than chance to share the green gene. Okay? So relatedness, R, is greater than 0. We'll say they're positive relatives. And spite is favored when individuals are negatively related. When the actor and recipient are unlikely to share the same gene, the recipient, in other words, is more likely to bear a rival gene. Okay? Now, there's tons and tons of examples. This is why I'm saying that psychology is sort of, should be a little bit chastened by how far behind we are in the study of kin recognition and kinship, is because biologists have been studying kin recognition in non-human animals, and I'll show you other organisms for a very long time, and have come up with all sorts of really cool examples. I can't give them to you all. Suffice it to say that we see kin recognition in birds. We see it in fish, like Pulcher here. We see it in all sorts of insects who use chemical cues. There are 2 great examples, the red fire ant and the Argentine ant, that do very interesting things. We see it in the sea dragon, I believe the name is called. Sea rocket. Sea rocket, thank you. This is work by Susan Dudley and Amanda File showing that even plants can recognize when they've been planted near a sibling. We see it in amoeba, who form, in this case, slime molds. It's a very creepy sounding thing, but they're very cool. We see it in brewer's yeast, the wild version of the same yeast that people use to make beer, and we even see it in malaria. Okay? Kin recognition is pretty pervasive, and it doesn't seem to require sophisticated systems to at least do the basic task. There are a number of different ways in which an organism can come to recognize its kin. I'm going to talk about 4 that are fairly prominent and would likely play a part in humans. The first one is actually quite understudied in humans, and it's basically assortment. And so you can imagine 2 populations, 2 theoretical populations that are represented by these bowls of soup. This is from a really lovely piece of work called Tidying Up Art by Ursus Verley. And in the first population, you have a randomly mixed bowl of soup. You have randomly mixed individuals. We call this a panmictic population. These individuals are no more likely to be related to their neighbors than anybody else. Okay? It's just a complete random mess. In the other bowl of soup, in the other population, you have individuals who breed right near where they were born. We call this a viscous population, and this means that your neighbors are very likely to be your genetic relatives. So we can actually come up with a very simple rule to help recognize family members. Chances are, if these individuals next to me are anything, they're my kin, and they're probably close kin. So this kind of mechanism helps to recognize family, and you can have a simple rule like help the individuals who are near me. It could be help the individuals who are in my burrow or in my nest over a certain age span maybe, but it's simply the notion that those individuals near me are probably my kin, I should help them. That's all well and good, but I think there are more interesting and more sophisticated mechanisms. There's some really great work I'm going to talk about by Deb Lieberman in her lab on two cues of kinship. One is what we're going to call mother-infant association, or maternal neonatal association. And again, this helps to recognize family. And the way this might work is, imagine when you're a kid, you see mom come home one day with an infant. And mom spends a lot of time with that infant. And other people get to play with that infant, other people take care of it, but really mom is spending most of her time taking care of this infant. The chances are really good that kid is your younger sibling. Very, very reliable cue that that kid is your sibling. So it again helps you to recognize family. Specifically, it helps you to identify who's actually a relative, who's your younger sib. So this is really reliable for older sibs. Younger sibs can't use this because the younger sibs don't see mom taking care of the older sibs nearly to the same degree as the older sibs see mom taking care of the younger sibs, right? The older sibs are a lot more independent. So it's reliable for old sibs and not so much for the younger sibs. But we do have something for the younger sibs, and this is co-residence duration. Imagine living with somebody for a day or a week versus living with somebody for many years. Chances are, if you live with somebody for many years, especially during childhood, those individuals are again your kin. So the longer you're living with individuals who are of similar age, the chances are those individuals are going to be your siblings. And this again then allows individuals to helps them recognize their close family. And it's useful specifically for the younger sibs. Not that the older sibs can't use it, but the older sibs don't need it because they already have the mother-infant association cue. So they don't actually really need this. And I'll show you some work from Deb Lieberman that demonstrates this exactly. So it turns out that co-residence duration, the amount of time you live with somebody, predicts cooperation and it predicts sexual attitudes. Now, I already explained to you why you should think that cooperation and kinship should matter. It won't be hard for me to illustrate why mate choice or sexual attitudes and kinship should matter. Imagine trying to mate with your sibling. If I imagine most of you, especially if you have an opposite sex sibling, you'll find that really creepy. And that's because we are designed to be averse to mating with close genetic relatives. And that's because there's a cost to very close inbreeding, that you should avoid mating with very close relatives because the offspring might have all sorts of problems, developmental problems along the way that are heritable. So we actually expect individuals to have mechanisms to determine who their kin are, and those mechanisms can then be used to regulate both cooperative behavior and sexual behavior at the same time. And this is work that Deb Lieberman has done. This is a very recent study. So one classic example of kinship manipulation that was unintentional are the Israeli kibbutzim. And these are sort of communal networks where children are often reared together, treated as if they're all part of the same family, even though they're not genetic relatives, and know that they're not genetic relatives. They know full well. But they all spend time together, they all eat together, the sort of parental duties are often widely shared. And it turns out the co-residence duration, the longer these kids live with one another, the less sexually attracted they feel to one another. In some earlier work, it was demonstrated that virtually nobody who grows up on a kibbutz together ever marries with one another. Even though there's no prescriptions against it, it's often encouraged that they marry with other individuals from the same kibbutz. It virtually never happens. But that the regulation about this seems to be at least in part about co-residence duration. Deb has also shown, if we're just going to look at the left side here, on a bunch of measures of both cooperation and sexual attitudes about incest, third-party moral opposition, things like that, that individuals who don't have the mother-infant association cues, in other words, the younger sibs, use co-residence duration to figure out whether or not they should cooperate with somebody and whether or not they find them sexually repellent. Whereas individuals who do have those cues, who are, for instance, the older sibs, don't use co-residence duration. So they actually interact. And she's demonstrated this with real-world data. Another classic field experiment, if you want to call it that, are the minor marriages of Taiwan. And in this case, individuals would often adopt a child who would grow up to be the future husband or wife of their own child and rear them together. You can imagine that that would turn out badly. And in fact, it does. The fertility rates and the divorce rates, the fertility rates are very low, the divorce rates of these couples are very high. And what Deb has shown is that the younger siblings use co-residence, or the younger mates, I should say, use co-residence duration. So the longer they've lived with their future husband or wife, the less sexually attractive they find them effectively. But the older individuals in the pair don't care about co-residence duration. They're already at almost maximum sexual disgust. They just don't want to mate with these individuals. Now, the last kin recognition system I'm going to talk about is my favorite because I think it's the broadest, it's the most exciting, and it allows us to do proper experiments. And I'll show you how we do that. But unfortunately, we can't do proper experiments on co-residence duration or on mother-infant association because you can't randomly pick up babies and switch moms. You can't move them from one house to another. That's just not ethical. So we can manipulate this last one, and this last one is known as phenotype matching. Here we have a picture of two of my friends, Scott and Kelly. They are of different ages, they are of different sexes, and I'm going to guess that it won't be hard for you to tell that they're related. They look a lot alike. Quite the opposite of me and my brothers or me and my nieces and nephews, for instance. So the idea behind this is that genetic similarity is going to be correlated with phenotypic similarity, and phenotypes are just the appearance of an individual. And that appearance could be the way they look, the way they smell, the way they sound. It could, with humans probably not, but with other organisms, it could be the way they taste and the way they feel. So the other thing to bear in mind with this concept is that individuals might be, who are more genetically similar, might be more phenotypically similar because of genes causing these differences, these similarities, but also because of shared environment. So two individuals who are more genetically similar might be raised in the same environment, they might eat the same kind of food, for instance, and that might have all sorts of effects on the way they smell, on the way they act, on the way they look. Okay? So it doesn't actually have to be caused by genetic differences for there to be phenotypic similarity correlated with genetic similarity. This is different from the others because it doesn't just help you recognize family, it helps you recognize relatives. You can determine who is more related to you within the household even. So you can hopefully use this to discriminate your full sibs from your half sibs. And you can use this outside of the household with people that you've never met. So people that you meet for the very first time, you might be able to tell how related they are by how similar they seem. Now, how would we actually do this? How would an organism judge similarity? I'm going to argue that they require two things. They need, once they encounter an individual who's a potential recipient, they need to know two things. They have to have a representation, a psychological instantiation in their head of some kind or another of a prototypical relative, okay, not necessarily a particular person, but maybe an agglomeration of individuals that are closely related that will resemble oneself, be acute to one's own genotype, and an average individual. And again, this isn't a real person, it's through sampling the environment potentially, one gets some sense of what the average individual in the population looks like. So I might walk around looking very puzzled, going, what do I look or sound or smell like? To determine a prototypical relative, a prototypical kin. If I can do that, it's hard to do that with look. So I could look at my hands, but looking at my face until very recently was a very difficult thing, right? Humans didn't really have mirrors not that long ago. So we can also use kin. What does my close family sound, smell, look like? And so these are individuals using the other cues, maternal perinatal association, co-residence duration, that I have a pretty good guarantee these people are my relatives. So what do they look like? And I can integrate those together. I can integrate that with my own perceptions of myself and create some kind of prototypical relative in my head, okay? And through sampling the environment, I can also ask, what does everybody else look, sound, smell like, and figure out what the average individual should represent, should look like. So if we were to visualize this, imagine that I've sampled my environment, and I figured out what my prototypical kin should look like, and I've also figured out what my prototypical average in the population should look like, and they're awfully similar, they're really just different shades of blue. Okay? So the kin individual, the kin prototype is a lighter shade of blue than the average. And now somebody comes along that I meet that happens to land somewhere between these two. It's a medium blue. And this is a potential recipient. How do I judge their relatedness? Well, because they're more similar to my kin prototype than the average is, in other words, beyond chance, they are a positive relative. The relatedness is above 0. And if I were to encounter instead an individual who lands on the other side of the spectrum, who's in fact more dissimilar to me than the average individual is, in other words, they're dissimilar beyond chance, they'll be a negative relative. The relatedness is less than 0. So it's exactly here that you might expect the evolution of altruism with positive relatives and the evolution of spite with negative relatives. If individuals can determine relatedness as a function of how similar that individual is to one's own genetic constitution, so to speak. So in the real world, we have evidence that perceived similarity does in fact predict relatedness. So if I were to take this half of the room and I were to show you a bunch of pictures of people, some of whom are siblings, let's say, and some of whom are not, and I don't tell you that, okay? You're just seeing a bunch of pictures. And I ask you with each pair to tell me how similar they look on a scale of 1 to 5. And with you guys, I put you in a room and I show you the exact same set of pictures and I simply ask you, tell me whether or not they're siblings. Yes or no, something like that. And then I correlate your judgments of each pair with your judgments of each pair. It turns out that that association is almost perfect. That judgments of similarity and judgments of kinship are effectively the same thing. So that's some really wonderful work by Maloney and Dal Martello. And if I were to ask you again to look at people you've never met who you're not related to and ask you to determine how related these individuals are, it turns out you're better than just siblings. You can judge the relationships between siblings, you can judge them between grandparent and grandchild, and to some degree aunts and cousins. We're not great at this, but we're good enough. And what's, of course, to bear in mind is that these aren't people you're related to. So it's pretty amazing that you can do this at all, right? It's not that you're doing this with your own family. Now, this actually plays a part potentially in real-world behavior. So there's an unfortunate saying out there, mama's baby, papa's maybe. And the idea goes to the notion that a woman who's just given birth to an infant knows that that infant is hers. And her husband, her partner, is not guaranteed that same assurance. It's known as paternity uncertainty, and it's possible that the sire of that offspring is in fact not her mate, but some other individual in the population. So there's a little bit of work showing that if men have low confidence that their mate has been faithful to them, then the resemblance of that child to themselves matters in their investment. At least they claim it does. So if you were to ask them, how similar does your child look to you? And how much do you invest in your child, using a bunch of different kinds of questions, it turns out that men who have low confidence in their partners still invest more in their putative offspring if that offspring resembles them, and less if that offspring doesn't. I said that we can do this experimentally, unlike everything else, and I'm going to show you how. There's been some really amazing modifications or advances in computer graphics over the last few years. And what we can use are morphing and transforming technologies to manufacture self-resembling faces that will give a cue of kinship. So imagine a participant walks in, the one on the right here walks in, we snap a picture of her, we give her some task, and we send her away for a week, and a week later she's supposed to come back and do another task. In the week that she's gone, we're going to delineate her face. We're going to put a bunch of points all over her face image to tell the software, basically, what the shape of her face looks like, where her eyes are, where her nose is, everything like that. That makes her face unique. And then we're going to take a bunch of other faces from previous participants, and we're going to do the same thing with them. And these participants are unknown to our new participant. Okay? We're going to call those base faces. And what we can do is we can morph, we can blend a fraction of the participant's own face shape. We can do this with color and texture too, but we mainly do it with shape, into the base face. So I want you to watch, keep your eyes on that base face and see what we do. We're going to take 40% of the participant's face and morph that with the base face. And now we have a self-resembling face. It's a very subtle difference. We try not to make this obvious to the participants. But this face now looks more like the participants than it did before. I'll show you one more time. Very subtly, it looks more like the participant. When the participant comes back in a week, she sits down at a computer and we tell her one of a number of different things, but one of them is you're going to do this economic task with other people at other universities, and you're going to see their picture and they're going to see yours, and you just have to decide how much money you want to give them, is sort of a general framework. And just so you understand, the more money you give those individuals, the more cooperative you're being. Okay? That's the basic thing you need to know for these experiments. And unbeknownst to them, these are not real people. The pictures are seeing some of them are self-resembling morphs and some of them are not. And we're just trying to see if they actually cooperate more with the self-resembling faces. So in a pioneering study by Lisa O'Brien done here at McMaster, she demonstrated that in fact that was the case, that our experimental subjects, when they're playing with individuals who are self-resembling, they trust them more by spending more money on them effectively than they do when they're looking at non-resembling faces. Now, Lisa O'Brien, Pat Barkley, and I have actually replicated this and extended it in a more, I would argue, a more fundamental social dilemma, arguably the fundamental social dilemma known as the tragedy of the commons. Participants would come in and they'd play in groups of 4. They'd see 3 faces on the screen, again told that there are other people at other universities. And we manipulated the faces such that 0, 1, or 2 of those 3 faces was self-resembling. The hypothesis being is that the more resembling individuals you have in your group, the more cooperative you'll be. On the y-axis, it's just how much more extra money they would give, okay, based on the facial resemblance. And we get this really lovely stepwise effect. People cooperate more with self-resembling faces, the more self-resembling individuals there are in the group. Now, what's really interesting is that we can actually do a similar kind of manipulation to make opposite sex faces. If I were to morph a male and a female face together, I'd get an androgynous face. It would not be pretty. But with transforms, we can make a very accurate looking opposite sex self-resembling face. So again, a participant comes in, we delineate her face, we send her away for a week, and now what we do is we take a whole bunch of other faces of people of the same sex, same age group, and same ethnicity. And we morph all of those faces together to make an average face. In this case, it's a same-sex average European descent woman, young woman. And what we're going to do is calculate the differences in the shape between our participant's face and the same-sex average face and apply those to a new face. We can add those to a new face. In this case, I'll show you an example of an opposite-sex average. So we've done the same thing, but with European descent young male faces. We've morphed those together. And we're going to just take the differences between whatever makes the participant different from the average face and apply it to that male average. So watch the male. Again, we've made a self-resembling transform. It's a very subtle difference, but the participants now get to see these faces as well as non-resembling transforms as controls. And participants simply see two faces on the screen, one of which will be self-resembling, one of which won't be. They, of course, don't know this. And they're simply asked one of three questions. Which one do you trust more? Which one do you find more attractive for a long-term relationship? Or which one do you find more attractive for a short-term relationship? Trustworthiness is basically a window onto cooperation. We expect more self-resembling faces to elicit more cooperation. Long-term and short-term attractiveness are subtly different. Short-term attractiveness is really about genetic benefits. So the question here is, how attractive do you find this individual for a one-night stand, for a date, something like that, where you're really not going to get a mate out of this so much as the sire of your future offspring, basically. Whereas long-term attractiveness mixes those two things. It mixes the cooperativeness potential of your mate with their genetic potential benefits. And again, in what I would argue is another pioneering study, also done here, Lisa demonstrated that self-resembling transforms, opposite-sex transforms, were more trustworthy, but they were in fact less attractive in short-term contexts. Now, she's replicated this and extended it and showed that there's a really amazing interaction between this and having younger siblings. So the more opposite-sex younger siblings one has, the more that short-term attractiveness effect looms large. In fact, it's in the opposite direction when you don't have younger opposite-sex siblings. So again, we get a statistical interaction between two different cues of kinship. It's quite interesting. So we don't always expect, the take-home message here is we don't always expect that short-term attractiveness bar to be negative, and I'll give you an example in a second. What's amazing about this technology is we can not just make self-resembling faces, we can make, which are supposed to be cues of positive relatedness, we can make anti-self-resembling faces. These are cues of negative relatedness. Remember how you have your kin prototype, you have an average prototype, and then you're evaluating a new individual, and if they fall on the other side, they're more different from your kin prototype than the averages, they're negatively related because they're negatively resembling. So again, we apply the same technology where we can add the differences between the participant's face and the same-sex average to the opposite-sex average. So watch the male face again, and it'll become self-resembling. But we can also subtract those differences to make his face look different from the participant. So watch his face. And now his face is anti-self-resembling. He differs from her in a way opposite to the way she differs from the average, if that makes sense. We've made a negatively resembling individual. So what we've done is we've replicated Lisa DeBrien's previous work on trust, long-term attractiveness, and short-term attractiveness of both self-resembling and anti-self-resembling faces against control faces. And we find, similar to Lisa, we find that there's a positive effect of self-resemblance and trust. We actually get a somewhat positive effect in attractiveness categories as well. Even though you can't tell, it's in fact the effect is largest for trust, not for the other two. That's the only one that's significantly different from zero. But overall, there's a positive effect of self-resemblance. And there's a negative effect of anti-self-resemblance. People treat the anti-self-resembling faces in the opposite way that they treat the self-resembling faces. They dislike these faces. This is the first study to show anything of the sort, and you can imagine this might lead into some other interesting problems. One has to do with psychopathy. Some of my research interests are in forensics, and a recent study that we've conducted has to do with violent psychopathic offenders. Psychopathy, you can use a measure known as the psychopathy checklist, the PCLR, and the higher an individual scores on this, the more likely we would categorize them as a psychopath. And we had the hypothesis that they should be discriminating, that if they're going to go out of their way to harm people, they should harm non-relatives. And that's exactly what we get here. We have first-degree relatives, second-degree relatives, and non-relatives. And the non-relatives are most likely to be victimized by psychopaths. You can see the bars shifted over this way. And first-degree and second-degree are more likely to be harmed by genetic relatives, by non-psychopaths, which is a pretty shocking finding. But this can also extend to more, I would say, ordinary, if not always nice problems. So this is an example of an extended family who all shares the same household. And it turns out that minority populations in a lot of different countries tend to have more larger extended families cohabitating in spite of how long they've actually lived in that country, so whether or not they're first generation, second generation, or third generation, as well as their income. So even after controlling for income, it turns out that minority groups tend to have larger extended families co-residing, which is an instance of cooperation. On the ugly side of this, we also have ethnocentrism and racism, where we might expect individuals of majority groups to be more ethnocentric than individuals of minority groups, and I'll explain why. And all of this might lead to the phenomenon of suicide terrorism. I'm going to give you just a tiny little taste of that because we don't have the time to go into it. But the model that I have is this. It's what I call asymmetrical relatedness. So imagine there's only two types in the population again, a light blue and a dark blue. But imagine that there's way more types of one than the other. So there's way more light blue individuals than dark blue individuals on average. If all of these individuals were to walk around and sample their environment, they would equally all come up with the same average, which is one that's a lot closer. If we were to align these guys in a distribution of phenotypes, the average is a lot closer to the light blue individual than it is to the dark blue individual. So if we take the light blue individual and they're judging the relatedness of the dark blue individual to themselves, they'll judge that dark blue individual to be very negatively related because they're very far away from the average. Conversely, the dark blue individual, sorry about that. The dark blue individual is going to perceive the light blue individual as being only slightly negatively related because they're actually quite close to the average. This leads to two really unique predictions. One, common types, whatever a common phenotype might look like, common types should be more spiteful towards rare types because the rare types are really negatively related to them than the rare types should be to the common types because the common types are only slightly negatively related to them. Conversely, rare types should actually be more altruistic towards other rare types than common types should be to common types because rare types are together very far from the average and therefore much closer to one another, whereas common types are very close to the average and not particularly close to one another. So I'm going to just push this right into suicide terrorism. Where actions are identifiably spiteful, we should expect that they'll occur between individuals of recognizably different phenotypes, at least recognizable to them, if not to an outside observer. So at the extreme, this can manifest as a variety of things: hate crime, ethnocentrism, or racism, and suicide terrorism, which is categorically spiteful. I say it's categorically spiteful based on some really interesting work by Robert Pape. I mean, we knew it's categorically spiteful before this, but he gives some really great numbers. Pape did a very thorough analysis of every single suicide terrorist attack from 1980 to 2003, which is in the ballpark of 300 attacks. And what he discovered was that even though suicide terrorist attacks only account for 3% of all terrorism in the world, it also accounts for 48% of all victim deaths. So it's incredibly spiteful. One kills oneself to kill a lot of other individuals. It's very, very disproportionate. And the thing that I find really interesting going through his data was the following. Every single case from 1980 to 2003, every single one was between ethnic groups. There was not a single within ethnicity spiteful suicide attack in that entire period of time. Obviously, this is just the beginning of an idea. There's a lot more to be done, but it's very likely that kin recognition somehow feeds into, presumably phenotype matching, feeds into the psychology underlying ethnocentrism and suicide terrorism. Kin recognition is routine and pervasive. We all do it. We do it all the time, and we're not aware of it. You're constantly judging the relatedness of the people that you're interacting with, just as much as you're evaluating their attractiveness and a bunch of other things. And what it does is it informs our decisions about cooperation and about mate choice at a very fundamental level. But because this work is psychologically in its infancy, we have a lot still to learn about how it's actually operating. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is that we take evolutionary theory much more seriously in psychological science than we have. There's been a movement to do this. It is increasing, but I think that we still have to continue working very hard on this. So that's my sad but take-home message there. I want to thank my collaborators, my research assistants, and my mentors and friends who have helped me with these different research projects over the years and who've really supported me along the way. Thank you.